Good morning. My name is Greg Lecker, and you are tuned in to Saturday Morning Live, another installment of my project called The Arctic Circling Back. I will revisit and develop a new body of work based on my 2022 artist residency in Svalbard, Norway, which for those who are not familiar with the geography there, if you consider the top of mainland Norway and the Nordic Peninsula, and then picture the North Pole. Svalbard is just halfway between those two. And Svalbard is the jumping off point for many of the Arctic explorers that were headed to the North Pole. I will share my experiences through a series of virtual and in-person demonstrations, in person mostly at my gallery, virtual such as today, and these are recorded and will be posted to my YouTube channel following. Today, I'm happy to share just a brief snapshot of where I'm at, which is not in Minneapolis. So it's 2 hours earlier where I'm. And we are just going to navigate over here to look out the window. And this is the Salish Sea. Um, There we go. That's a better shot. So this is looking out from San Juan Island, where I am spending time on a science-based artist residency at a field station of the University of Washington. And I'm speaking to you from my apartment overlooking the water in the islands. That's probably Orcas Island across the water. And I'm also blessed to have an artist studio and access to the dining hall, which is just wonderful. So I have much time to spend making art. And now we're going to circle back to where I'm working. And during this residency, much like the residency of the Arctic, I will paint my experiences and also teach nature drawing for the students at the University of Washington which is called UW as opposed to UW, which would be University of Wisconsin. Shifting now to the subject of today's demonstration, which is watercolor, which is appropriate since I'm surrounded by water on all sides, it seems. And I will share two different main types of watercolor, which is the typical watercolor blocks that you see here, which is a set by Koi. It's in a blocks with some additional areas to put water and then to be able to paint, which is handy, and also to use a brush pen. And then the other component is Derwent Intense Color Blocks. And these are really handy because they allow a person to draw as well as to paint. And there are three main aspects of painting that one can do with the Derwent, and I will demonstrate those as well. So shift these over slightly so that you can see the watercolor paper primarily. Let's stick this on here, make sure that we get things on camera. pour a little bit of water into here. Got some additional palettes of a couple different varieties. I'm nothing but a bit unconventional, and so I may paint using the reservoirs that are in the blocks there. I may paint using my made-up palette, which is bottle caps with inside a tub top or another type of container, which is here. So just it's handy to, when I was in the Arctic, I was primarily painting using the small disposable water bottle and then dipping into the cap and painting. Another tool would be the brush pen, which comes in the koi set, and I'll demonstrate that now. So you can squeeze a little bit, and water drops out, and one can paint just like um, many other types of aspects. With watercolor, there is a rough side and a smooth side. And so if I draw across the two, you will see. So we've got some rough, we've got some water, which diffuses a little bit more in the smooth. Again, the notion of the rough and the smooth. So different effects. This water or this rough side can absorb maybe a little bit more water than the smooth. The smooth is going to do a little bit of rolling off. So that's brush pen, which is very handy if you're ever doing work in museums. Your water is all contained in this reservoir, and so you're not bringing in extra water. Art conservators frown on bringing in water into museums. So dry media, like drawing, is great. You most likely will not be ever painting in a museum unless you have secured prior approval. So then if we use a brush instead of the brush pen, maybe a little bit more variety, different size brushes. But the brush pen, you just turn it on its side and you can get some wide areas. So it's fairly versatile. And so that's very helpful. The Derwent blocks, and that's this. And one of the other cool things about this is that one can put 5x7 sheets in the top. There is a thumb handle or finger handle on the bottom, so you can hold this in your hand. I cannot turn it over since we've got water in there already, but know that there is a little loop on the bottom of the brush of the box. You've got your paper here, and so you can do some with a kit that's very portable. This can certainly fit in a small bag, or if you have a pouch of a jacket, you can work with that. You can do your painting on that side or vertical. And if you can rotate it horizontally or vertical, depending on if you're working more dry brush, where it's maybe more, maybe a bit more detail, where the brush is going to, the watercolor is going to spread less. And so that's very handy. Or if you have more water, then probably want to incline it a little bit more because it may run if you have it tilted upwards or not, depending on how this is even on the smooth side. So this is fairly absorbent paper. This is 140-pound paper. So there we get some running. If you keep adding water, like a typical watercolorist, you can keep a leading edge wet and cover some areas and even add some blending here and there. And let it run a little bit, and that all works. That works great. So that is that. The alternative to something like this, and this also comes with a palette that's a handy cover so that when you close it, your paper is not going right um, into your wet palette. And you can also move this off to the side, to the left or to the right, and have some additional room to paint on. So a larger palette, larger working area, even though it's all handheld. I'm holding that with one hand and I've got another hand free to be able to do brush work. So that's very handy. The other option is the Derwent collection, which I really am a fan of. And that is dealing with chalks like this. Chalks which are water soluble and which one can draw or paint with. And Derwent Intense Blocks, it advertises as being it's 24 colors, plenty of colors in my opinion. Advertised as 1832 onward. So, and I'm going to just put a little water inside this cap, inside this cover, and you will see why in a bit why I'm doing that, because that is just another aspect that I'm going to demonstrate with unlike the typical watercolor blocks where you're using a brush, the Derwent sticks are really, in my opinion, very versatile in terms of what a person can use. One can put towels here. So these are some aspects that I really enjoyed, and I used this in Svalbard, Norway, because the access and the time availability to do different tasks was a bit limited by the time that we might be stopping at a other location. So one can draw with it with a pastel. You've got some different effects, the difference between the rough versus the smooth, lying the chalk on its side, rougher, smooth sided paper. That's on its edge. This is on the side, very similar, maybe a little bit broader. And that's just fine as it is, and it will stay more or less fixed. You can spray fixative. Actually, I don't know that fixative doesn't work so much because it's liquid, so don't do that. But put under glass or not handling it very much works fine. Or you can activate it with a brush, and then you can get just as if you were doing the watercolor up above, different effects, turn the brush on its side, blend some different areas. And you can control the saturation by adding a bit more color, a bit more water, I should say. And in the Arctic, when I was painting, there were times that we landed on an extremely small rock outcropping where there was enough room for my bum and my bag next to me. And then after that, the rock just slid down into the water. And this is not the shore water. This is very deep water because we had been transported there via a Zodiac. And so they kept the motors running, and we essentially stepped off um, the little boat onto the rock and then found a place to work. And so it was a little tight quarters in terms of being able to work. And in that case, I don't know that I even had my water with me, but there was little patches of snow next to where I was working, and I could just take my brush and scoop up some snow from where I was working and then scrub it onto the palette. The watercolors mostly when we were working worked fine because it was temperatures range from a high of 40 down to 32 and then drop down to 26. Up until or down to 32, the watercolors worked fine. However, below 32, it's remarkable how quickly the water would set up and crystallize in the on the paper and just even in the small water caps that I would be working with. So that was very interesting. But here's the trick about the Derwents is that so there's it's the color that it is, but one can take the block and holding it on its sides works fairly well. Dip it into the tray, which is then fairly shallow, so I'm not dipping the entire thing in, but then take this and draw it across the paper, and one can get much both more intense as well as more maybe more painterly types of effects. And it is the same color. Uh, yes, this is the same color, but just it's a bit more saturated. It's definitely going to get a little bit thicker paint application. And so that is that. Another way to use it. So we've done the drawing, adding water afterwards, but then we can also use these as like small blocks and then paint on that. And that it all works great. It's all different in terms of what a person is doing. And it just depends on sometimes it's what time a person has to work with. So if you use this as a block and draw across, again, same color as this is the Koi water blocks. This is the Derwent drawing and then adding color, adding water. And then this is using each stick as a block and adding some water there. So hopefully that gives you a general idea of what your different options are. It's all watercolor, it's all water-based media. This is more drawing. This is more painterly. This is somewhere in between. One could almost think of it as like a palette knife type of approach. You can get variety of different types of effects depending on what you're after and even how much time you have, because it's all subject to the amount of time and the location when you're doing field painting. In the studio, it's quite a different option because you have all the tools, all the comforts of home that you can work with, and that allows you maybe more flexibility, but there's no substitute to being able to go out in the field and work. So I want to demonstrate now painting a scene. It's a scene that I've done a number of times. Yes, I have a reference photo on my phone, which is frankly an oil painting of the scene. And it's of a braided river or braided stream, I should say, coming off from it's going to lift up the watercolor paper now so that we can go to the boards that are already set up. Now now this is smooth side up, so I can get a little bit more detail if I want. We're going to rotate that because we'll probably flip it up. Well, we'll work one scene and then work the other scene. So first I'm going to paint with the typical watercolor set. So you can see I'm not sure if I'm going to say more refined, but more typical approach to watercolor. So we've got the painting, and I may or may not be using, I won't be using this painting. I will move that out of the way, but I may be using this as just an additional palette. And I will show both the brush pen and the other painting types of aspects. And just so you can see what it is that I'm painting. This is the scene that's an oil painting. That's not even necessarily the finished oil painting that I had done, but it is enough information there that I can paint on. So I'll likely be working from light to dark just so that I can manage the colors here. And I'm going to use some of the frame. I'm not as familiar with all of the colors that are on this. That's Prussian blue, where my violet is, till I get more paint and more used to that. It's still some, we'll do a little mixing then of what we need to do. Okay, so there we get some violet. And we're going to turn the brush pen on its side because we're drawing in the clouds. I'm going to first lay in some color with the lighter condition. Sorry to be jumping around just a little bit. Realizing that probably better to lay in the lighter first, and then once it's wet. So this is going to be the areas of the sun breaking through the light clouds. And going to a little bit brighter colors as we get to where the sun, now when the sun was there where we were working, it was fairly low in the sky. We're also going to put in just a little bit of color, a little bit of light in some of the areas where I will be working next, which are some highlights in the water. There will be a water stream coming down this way. As you can see here, if I bring that over. And so we'll have some color into that. I'm doing it purposefully just a little bit brighter and leaving some whites there as well. So we've got some color. We'll be drawing mountains on top of some of those. We'll let that dry, tack up just slightly, and we may jump to some of this water in this area here, which is maybe some brighter colors because we're reflecting what the scene is. And I may lift just a little bit of this because if it's ever so darker than what I was wanting, then that's a way to lift just a little bit of that. The main difference between the purplish and the yellow is that the yellow is more reflecting the bright sun areas that are peeking behind the clouds, and the more purplish areas are the areas of some of the clouds, but still light. It still is a light source compared to the landscape that is there. So that is that. And I may do some of the same effects on the Derwent. Now the Derwent, maybe it's not as plentiful of the colors, but it still is relatively um, you just maybe it's not as I'm wetting the couple blocks. I'm not going to be drawing this so much on there will be some aspects of it that will be drawn. I'm still going to use a little bit of color and you'll see the purpose of so again, slightly, maybe a little bit more, um, not ruddy, but a little bit more reduced saturation. Not a bad thing. And the reason I'm doing some of this now is just in the interest of time, to let the colors set up so that I can do other colors on top. With the clouds, I'm not going to use the rough texture of I'm just going to draw in a little bit of the same type of reflection in the water, the same effect here, just down here. So here we've got block, watercolor. Here we have Derwent. So by now this is mostly set up enough that now I feel like I can go in and do some of the sky. So we've got some of the sun there. We're going to do the sky. Now the sky, it may be darker than what one expects because it is so it's kind of a muted and have just a touch of the reddish brownish there. So and whether or not you know, watercolor often sets up a bit darker, I'm sorry, a bit lighter than what it is when you put it down. So somewhat like acrylic painting, but maybe even more so. So we're putting in, and we're going to let it break up, in my opinion, because that creates some different sky conditions, but not as sharp of a breakup as would be with drawing the Derwent or doing like the edge of a pastel. I consider myself a oil painter first, and then a watercolorist second, certainly. But one of and maybe a question would be, well, why watercolor or why oil painting? I like maybe the control of it. The watercolor is a bit more free flowing, easier to certainly to get softer edges. But maybe the control is not quite there that one would get with the oil painting, but it works. So then if one uses the same Derwent, some of these colors here. So let me get a little bit, I don't know that I completely have violet, but I at least have the blue and have the other colors here. All right. So again, this is with drawing some of the colors here and maybe still mixing on a palette. So you can imagine some of the effects are going to be very similar. The colors might vary just slightly because of the differences in that. Now, if one were to take the chalk, now once the paper is wet, then one could draw in the chalk. You can get some finer edges there, but realize it's going to be a bit darker than what maybe one would like, but you can always go in and soften that a bit with some of these. But do recall that it's probably better to do that on surfaces that appear more solid, as in the landscape versus the clouds, because it's once it gets on there, the roughness of the paper is going to absorb the some of the colors, some of the pigment, I should say, and will transform that. And if I was doing the sky with the Derwent, I might do the landscape and then pick up some of the color into the sky with a wet brush versus trying to get exactly the right color in the sky with the Derwent, at least the amount of colors that I have here, 24 colors. There's a lot of greens and browns, and I don't have a lot of greens in the landscape here. It's mostly browns, mostly monotone, monochromatic. But so now we're going to be going into the mountains that are in front of the clouds, starting with the more typical watercolor here. And now at this point, it could be using some of the chalks that I have. That's black. Some of these maybe a little difficult to tell exactly the color as well. We've got more of a maybe cobalt grayish color. So, and maybe here I will do a bit of the mountain first in the Derwent so you can see. And I'm going to vary what the mark making. I try to impress on students that with painting and as an artist, the variety of mark making is important in terms of creating variety. So some light control on using the edge, the end of the block here. And I'm remembering the aspects of the prismatic palette that further areas are going to be more bluish grayish, receding versus the nearer areas which will have more color. It's mostly a bluish grayish color. So the edges of the mountains that are there. And then contrasting that with the watercolor, the typical watercolor, I should say. So, and I'm often using a lot of the same brush, just washing it out. And it's maybe not as, um, I'm turning it on the side, I can get a lot of detail as well as covering larger areas here. So we've got some of the dark edge of the mountain and maybe varying it just slightly in terms of creating some lost and found edges where it's harder than maybe softer. So you can hopefully see a difference between the drawing with the Derwent, watercoloring with this. And I'm going to purposefully not blend too much of the drawn Derwent so that you can see the difference between the two watercolor techniques. This palette just ever so slightly so that you get more in the field of view for both. Then moving down into the hill structure, which is here, a variety of browns as well as greens. And I'm going by memory of what both the photographs and other work that I've done. I've been painting, working with that scene quite a bit. Um, First with the Derwent and some of the, I'll say foothills maybe, had some different banding of the the hill structures. Now we did not hike up into there. The distances are a bit deceptive. It's further away than what you would think. We were primarily walking along the edge of the shore. But if you like drawing, the Derwents really lend themselves to that. You can get drawing effects. You can get seemingly detailed effects with the Derwent by turning it on its different edges. You get different types of effects, and then maybe layering a little bit of, you're almost blending it dry onto the into the paper, and then by adding water on top of it, one then can activate it. And so you can do a lot of just drawing first and adding some of the watercolor second. Then if we move on to onto the watercolor, getting some browns, some getting a kind of olivey brownish color. And I'll just kind of segregate my warms and my cools here. We don't have lots and lots of times to do both, but here we've got so a little bit less control, which whether a person likes that or not is up to the person. Um, yeah, if I want to add just a little bit of the greeny in this area. Bit, bit of touch of the warmth here. And I may use some of that to just draw down. I want to keep this edge, so I don't want to get too close to that. That's a bit of a challenge because it is tilted up just ever so slightly, but I'm going to trust that I can control it. So just trying to blend that edge just slightly. And one can scrape a little bit into the watercolor before it starts breaking down the tooth of the watercolor. One can lift slightly to lighten the air. And this is lightening already. Some of the sky condition lightened somewhat from what was there. But definitely a difference between the two. This is maybe seemingly a bit more detailed than this. But I can go back in and do some of the other colors. I want to have time here to work on the planes, the more distant planes, and then into the foregrounds. And I may, to that end, I may put in the highlight side of some of the rocks that are here in the foreground in both areas, just so that we can see that, let that dry up before I add some of the different edges of the blocks. It was very rough, kind of gravelly, not I'll say coal-like. It wasn't coal. Yes, they do have coal mining, but there was some variety of edges, not so much pockmarked coal, but still something different. And I'm going to do maybe a variety, maybe of that same um, warm color combination of that and this color. So slight difference between those two. There's one that is a bit lighter, one that's a bit darker, and it's reflecting the sky. And I'm just going to draw plane across there. I might go to the slightly darker in this distant plane. It may be difficult. So one can see. So we've got a bit more of the cooler plane here, and a bit more of the warmer planes here. And I may go there with the water brush and suggest where some of the planes are. And already there's aspects of this that I feel much more secure with the Derwent than I do with watercolor. Um, maybe it's uncertainty, who knows? Maybe it's more the way that it parallels with what um, oil painting is, but now I want to lay in some of the same colors in general as I would have in with the watercolor blocks that are here, the watercolor brush. And maybe I'm working more on dry brush. Um, so we've got the plane, and it's back here, looking at some of my edges that I will be using. So we've got at least something up both. I want to be conscious of the time, make sure that you can see how the whole thing is coming together as I move onto some of the darks, which is what's going to happen next. So again, we're going to do first some of the Derwent, and then moving into the others. So I'm going with a somewhat dark. It's going to be a combination of the blacks and the blues. We're going to suggest some of it's the edges of the watercourse, somewhat gravelly. It's very easy to get more sharp lines with the Derwent, and then just with a little bit of water, one can soften that. And in my opinion, with the Derwent, it allowed me to work, I believe, faster than what some of the other aspects of the watercolor. I probably do a lot of almost drawing as I'm doing my painting, combination of drawing and filling in planes. So we've got some of the defining a bit of the edges that we have there before we go in with some of the more purplish color that's going to define some of the differences between the wave action that's happening here. And we'll see how that goes with I may switch to the brush pen because remember we were able to get some details with that. So switch now to the more typical type of painting, and you can squeeze with the brush pen. So again, a little bit of the detail that a person like me likes with regards to, and then easily being able to turn that brush on its side and get some broader areas. So even the brush pen is an apt name for this because it acts like a pen. You could actually probably write a word on that if you wanted, like ice. in terms of the ice that we were seeing up there, or water maybe would be more apt. But the ice was coming from the glaciers that were up here down into the water. So that's that. And then down in the brush pen, now this is an aspect where I would say that probably having working with put that there, the violety color that I'm trying to get probably lends itself to the edge of that. And again, working down here in the Derwent. And it's ever so slightly, more the violety color that I wanted, um, versus so much magenta coming down. Maybe lifting up just a little bit of that, which I feel that is too dark. But, and I may use some of the brush pen here to get some of the ripples that I recalled in that area. This and some areas of this are some of the brightest areas of the area. I know there's a lot of white here and maybe some of the sky here too, which I may go back in and get a little bit more of that. Said I'm restricting the lights and the darks to the sky. Values are all about the perception of the light effects. I'm trying to lift up just a little bit of this up into the sky here. There. A little bit more towel work, even with a little bit of the water. A bit like an eraser of sorts. So then moving back to the typical watercolor, and in this area, again, working both with the combination of the brush pen and the regular brush. It's more intense than what it wants to be, so we'll use some of that for some of the areas here. And when we've got it light enough, then it's going to be some of the ripple edges going around here. And again, I want to remember that that is going to be some of the brightest areas. So we'll incrementally darken some of the areas than we had than what is there on the paper currently. All right, so let's work a little bit into some of these areas in terms of just slightly. I don't want to belabor that too much in the time that we have there. But we certainly have, my recall of that is that that was some of the darkest areas that we have going on, and especially the edge. I'm trying to vary my marks so that trying to show some texture of rocks that are in this area maybe some stippling here and there to try to define the, my apologies, I want to make sure that you can see what I'm doing. Calling it stippling, using the edge of the brush, keeping in mind it's a horizontal plane, so that is a focus of the direction of the things. I'm not doing verticals, in other words. And then I may use some of that to do some of the maybe foothills that were in the back. As the landscape comes forward, it's a bit darker. Lifting up some of that green that occurred more back here than it did on the, I'm just filling in some of those lights. I want to kill that white because that it was not present there in the hill. The hill is not an illuminated surface. And you'll see some of that. I may be activating some of this now just so you can see what's going on. If I were to pick up some of the color and add some of the color, you can see by adding more or less water, I can activate these areas onto the mountain. So it's just a different process and steps. I was drawing first and then adding water. Versus in the watercolor, maybe it was more direct. And so there's enough pigment on there as long as I keep track of what I'm dragging through so I'm not picking up colors that I don't want to. Like I would not want to be working into the sky at this point. That would be bad to be bringing darks into that. If I'm going to have an edge, in some cases I want the edge to be up against the sky. In other cases, not so much because it's maybe more of a lost edge. And they're just different. This maybe still has some more texture that is a softer effect in a way. And I'm probably going to go in both cases and lay in a little bit of lightness into this plane because it's picking up some of the sky, but not as much as the brightest area of this in the remaining time that we have, which is not a lot. So so if I was doing in both cases, I'm drawing from the water blocks here, so I want to be fair. So drawing that across, maybe letting a little bit of some lights show through. And then in the case of the Derwent, maybe it's picking up just a little bit of the edge of the a lot faster than drawing with the pen. Just lifting it up and gives a little bit of effect there. Almost the sandy, gravelly areas. We need to get some of the foreground now with the gravelly area of this. Keep fingers out of the way so you can see what's going on. If it's rolling now, the hands are going to get a little bit of pigment picked up, especially with the darker colors. So maybe it's like the edges of the, again, I'm going by a little bit of memory of some of there was a lot of hard edges with the reflections and the edges with the light. So if I'm going to do anything, I'm going to preserve those areas and maybe darken up some other areas slightly, putting in some areas here that I'm going to do some slight blending here that's going to darken up this whole area in the last minutes going on. And if I was doing that with the brush pen, then we're going to keep dipping into the pigment to get some of the very dark areas. And it's more about the contrast that's going on than it is we're cheating just ever so slightly. We're grabbing some of the Derwent because it's right here. We might cheat even a little bit more with the Derwent since we've got that here. So hopefully you can see that we've got some foreground going on there. And then adding some color here, which is going to blend a lot of this color together, soften some areas of the Derwent. And because the we'll go a little bit over time here. I want to be able to get some finished work here. But here you get the gist of what is going on. I just want to kill some of we'll switch to just a little bit of the warm color here to draw on top and let that lie. Just want to kill some of the whites there because it's definitely not white in the reflected highlights of that foreground field. But I want it to be a contrasting value or warmth to and then we'll add just a touch of that. I feel like this can maybe afford to be slightly more of with select areas in the more typical watercolor block. I don't want to cover up all of the warmth that I had. We'll continue doing a little bit of stippling here. And we'll do maybe a final wash over that to connect these edges, or we'll see. I want to preserve some light reflections off the sky into that, but also kill some of these lights that are on the hillside. Yes, they were light because they were horizontal planes, but not as not as light as the sky. So it's starting to come together in terms of these being solid plains versus the water and the sky being more um, luminous areas. And one could put in some, make sure that you can still see, put in some edges here in terms of the planes that are going across, combination of maybe dipping into the water. So there we have a little bit more saturated color than some of the other. There's even more. It's not always control about the Derwent too. Some of it maybe is um, bit of happenstance here and there, happy accidents, I should say, like that. I'm liking some of that, but I don't want to lose lose that. Um, and if I was doing that in the Derwent, I'm sorry, in the typical watercolor, then I would draw some of I have so much black in there. Let's squeeze out some of that. With the brush pen to be able to wash it off, it's fairly easy to, yes, you could wash out the brush in this, but by squeezing, hopefully this is coming through, by squeezing you're squeezing the color, the water out of the brush pen. And so that also helps to wash out. And then certainly a towel is a good thing. Always have paper towels, but you could also have napkins in your pocket from a lunch or whatnot. With the brush pen, it's uh, fairly small. So, but just when you get a little bit um, of some of that color that I like because it's a nice contrast to the blues and the greens. It activates the color contrast and brings out some of the values that are here. The chroma, I should say. And the fact that I've painted this scene a number of times, painted or rendered it both in oil painting or in block print or in scratchboard helps me considerably in terms of the ability to make this scene happen, whereas I could not do that in the time that I have. So I don't have, I'm not even really referring to the reference photograph very much at this point. It's just working by memory of the scene since it's impregnated in my. So still, this is a bit lighter. This is lighter, this is lighter, this is darker. So maybe still the hills need to be brought up just ever so slightly darker. There's a fine difference between the vertical shadows here and the horizontal shadows here. Some of it is the combination of the whites showing up here versus the more consistent darks there. Um, Sometimes adding in the complement, one can darken things even more so than just by adding darker colors, so more of a control. Versus it. I try to limit my use of black because it's more that's graying and very much what we're doing is all about light. And black tends to gray out and make something look dead versus the colors. Just want to restate some of the edges against the sky. So I don't want to busy the sky up very much on these two. I may want to bring in just a little bit of detail with regards to some of these ripples here going on. So which do you prefer? Not the finished effect, but which do you prefer in terms of the working, the Derwent, the watercolor, chalks and brushwork, maybe a combination of the two? I'm open to thoughts that people might have in terms of what people might like in terms of working process of one versus the other. It's no right or wrong answer. It's just what maybe a person is into one type of medium. They're both watercolor medium. Don't want to misspeak there in terms of um, what it is. It's similar type of scene, one versus the other, but slightly different effects. So here we have the more typical water color painting with blocks. Could be a palette or could be dry areas. And so we've got some of those effects. Or we have the use of the Derwent drawing pastel. I'm saying pastels. It's not really pastels. One could say maybe water. It's water soluble chalks and that effect.